Hey, also a quick overview of the different powers of I here. So when we learned about I last week, we learned that I is defined as being the square root of -1. So that is the definition of I. So I guess I can write that right here as well, square root of -1. So now there's some patterns that develop with I when it comes to raising it to exponents. So first off, I squared, and this is going to be a really important one. I squared, remember when you square something, it means you multiply it by itself. So like -1 times root -1. Or we can think of that as square root of -1 squared. When you square root, they cancel out. So really, when you square I, you're left with just -1 because that square and the I cancel out. So I squared is just a plain -1. And actually, when we did this last week, we talked about how the whole reason we had I is because we needed something that when we squared it, it equaled a negative. Okay, I cubed now. So remember, that means I times I times I. Or we can think of that as I squared times I, right? Well, we just said that I squared was -1. So really just turns into -1 times I. So that means I cubed really just turns into a negative I. Like I said, these are just some some cool patterns that come out of our I's. And then lastly, I to the fourth. And I to the fourth means we're multiplying I times itself 4 times. So we could think about that as I squared times I squared. I squared is -1, so if we do -1 times -1, negative times negative cancels out. So really that equals 1. So ironically, with all these imaginary numbers, I to the fourth just equals 1. And then this pattern repeats itself, because if you go to I to the fifth, that would be like doing I to the fourth, which is 1 times I. You get back to where you started. So this is the cycle of I's, because as you then keep going, I to the fifth would turn into I to the fourth times I. I to the fourth just equals 1 times I, which equals itself. So you end up right back to where you started. The part that's really going to come into play with us with these simplifying is the fact that this I squared is equal to -1. And you'll see how that comes into play on the next slide.